Hello, and welcome back to Sex, Love, and the Self, exploring how we can be better beings through stories about love, relationships, and life. I grew up as a good kid. I followed all the rules. I did what my parents wanted. I came very late to the idea of rebellion. I had kind of a brief flirtation with it in my teenage years, defying my curfew. My parents found a boy in my bed one time. And even my first year at college was pretty tame. I had gone with my boyfriend, and so, we did things that were maybe a little bit outside of what my parents would have considered appropriate at the time. But I didn't really rebel. I didn't really get wild. Do you know what I mean? The second year that I was in college, however, I went by myself to a different university. And man, did I embrace the freedom that brought. Drinking and drugs and sex and all of it. I mean, it was still pretty tame stuff. I smoked. That second year in college, my idea of what rebellion was and what it meant wasn't really a conscious thought, but it meant stepping out of the definition that had been provided to me by my parents about who I was and who I was supposed to be. And I loved that exploration. Looking back on it now, I think my definition of rebellion, my understanding of what it means to get a little crazy once in a while, is more rooted in the idea of embracing freedom and taking risks. And I mean that in responsible ways, of course. There are ways to do that go too far, and sometimes I do those too. But as I discovered in that second year of college, when I fell in love for the first time, that's a whole other kind of getting crazy. That's a whole other kind of risk taking. Because it means a different thing. Like, the stakes feel higher. The worst case scenario won't be that, I spent too much money at the bar, I woke up hungover. Getting wild, getting a little crazy and risk taking in that context might mean that I miss class the next day, or I don't get an A on the test. Getting a little wild, getting a little rebellious in the context of romantic relationships feels like it's other level risky, because loving someone is not actually a well-calculated risk. Like, doing a cost-benefit analysis, a risk-reward analysis on romantic relationships probably doesn't look that good, in all honesty. Like, if we were to really break it down, the chances that this beautiful thing that we feel, this love or this person or this relationship that we have, there's a good chance that won't work, particularly when we're young. Letting ourselves get a little crazy in the context of romantic relationships means risking our hearts. And in a traditional cost-benefit analysis, risk-reward analysis, that would probably guide us to not allow ourselves to fall in love, to hold those boundaries hard. And when I did get my heart broken that second year in college, I realized I definitely wanted to avoid doing that again. Heartbreak is the worst. I decided that the way to protect myself was to invest fully in the relationships, to go all in. If I gave them everything, if I devoted myself to them right out of the box, it was less likely that they would leave me, in my mind. And there certainly wasn't any getting wild in the relationships. I was staying fully in the safe lane, committed, boundaried, forever. But those relationships didn't work either. And after every breakup, it seemed clearer and clearer to me that, quote, responsible love, this boundaried, committed, all-in kind of love that I had been giving, didn't work either. I could put all the boundaries I wanted around love and relationships and partnership building, and it would still end in heartbreak, or might. Love hurts. It just does. We're going to get our hearts broken. Whether our partner dies or our love does, it's going to end one way or the other. So in the context of romantic relationships, if we know it's going to hurt, if we invest our hearts, if we let ourselves really love, is it worth it to get wild and risk it? Getting wild to me means embracing freedom. It means stepping out of the norms of what would be considered, appropriate behavior or logistical decision making in context of what's right for ourselves or our lives or society. It's about following our crazy little hearts. And we do it so easily as kids. As kids, it doesn't feel like risk. We don't really understand embarrassment yet. We don't really feel that deep humiliation or shame when we screw shit up. There's very little fear of physical pain. There's very little fear of emotional pain. And we have this safety net that's put up for us by our parents or our guardians or our authority figures in school or whatever. They kind of create a safe place for us to step outside our own boundaries and explore without really getting hurt. And then we go through this whole adolescent period of struggling against those boundaries back and forth, back and forth. And the almost comical irony is that when we finally get that freedom back as adults, when we have all the rights and decision-making responsibility over our entire lives, often we get a little wild for a little while, like maybe in our early 20s, we go out too often or sleep with too many people or whatever it is. But there are still these boundaries that are drawn around our lives that we create. We have to create limits for ourselves and barriers and kind of borders around the ways in which we're going to allow ourselves to step out of logical right and do what we really want. In the context of our professional lives, in the context of our personal lives, in the way that we risk or don't buying a house, for instance, or going back to college. For me, that window of time was very short. I stepped into the ability to have freedom, adult level, total control over my own life, freedom, and immediately put up walls, like Trump-style, huge concrete walls around what was and wasn't okay for me, what was and wasn't appropriate fun, what was and wasn't the right thing to do in relationships, all of that. I was going to do things right. I wanted to be successful. I wanted to, do something valuable in the world. Mostly, though, I wanted to avoid being hurt, because that's the other cruel irony of gaining all this freedom as adults. Now we know shit hurts. There's so much fear of embarrassment, judgment from others. We censor ourselves. We moderate what we wear, what we say, or how we interact in the world. And often that comes from appropriate places. Like, of course, there are ways that we need to adjust perhaps a little bit to be successful in an office setting, for instance. And all of that is important. It's part of our growing process. It's part of our evolution, our development. But most of us at some point kind of take it too far. We get a little too over-concerned with what others think of us. We begin to compare ourselves to others, their success, their beauty, their relationship, their work. In our exploration of what boundaries we're going to set around what's right or wrong for ourselves in our own lives, we start to give a lot more consideration to physical and emotional pain. That shit matters now. We know. We know how much it sucks to be embarrassed in front of a lot of people, or how much it sucks to feel like we're not as good as everybody around us, or how much it sucks to have our hearts broken. And so, often, one of the things that we do to give ourselves little windows of liberation in which we can do whatever we want, we turn to drugs and alcohol. Because that, first of all, lowers our inhibitions. Awesome, exactly what we were looking for. But it also excuses our behavior. It's like giving ourselves a night, perhaps, or a few hours that function almost like a weekend in Sin City, in which we can do whatever we want for a little while. But even that scenario is heavily boundaried around, what we might have to do the next day, the responsibility we feel to our jobs or our family, whatever. And there's nothing wrong with that. Those boundaries are important. I'm not talking about avoiding the boundaries altogether. The thing is, sometimes we end up using drugs and alcohol not only to give ourselves these little windows of freedom, but also to avoid feeling embarrassed, to avoid feeling heartbroken. Over time, we often begin to realize that using drugs and alcohol are not necessarily the appropriate way for us to give ourselves that little window of liberation, because those things don't help us to function in our normal lives. Like, a hangover when you're 40 is a completely different thing than a hangover when you're 25. And so we start kind of dropping the substances, which is, in my opinion, a good thing, a wonderful thing. Because in reality, the truth is, those feelings that we may be trying to avoid in conjunction with this little, freedom window, liberation window, whatever, those feelings are going to exist anyway. We can ignore them, we can tamp them down, we can numb them all we want to, but they exist. And if we don't deal with them, they're just going to continue to exist. So letting go of using substances as a tool to avoid the feelings is a useful thing. We need to learn to be able to feel and just accept that as part of the process of being a human, part of the experience of being a human. Hopefully, we begin to understand and accept that, and we can acknowledge that those feelings are temporary. So as adults, we begin to realize that those feelings just are going to exist. We're going to have to deal with them, and they're temporary. So the alcohol and drugs perhaps become less important. They become a less useful tool for us. And we kind of start avoiding that, or at least not doing it as often, usually, hopefully. But the thing that comes along with that is that we often also then stop getting wild. We stop giving ourselves these windows of opportunity in which to just do whatever we want for a minute or for a day or for a week. We go on vacation perhaps, but we take the whole family along. We go out with our buddies one night perhaps, but it's still very limited, very boundaried. For me, eventually, when I came to that point and I had kind of dropped the alcohol and everything, I got wild in other ways. I traveled all the time. I had unattached sex. I took risks in my career, calculated ones, albeit. Because the thing is, there's value in getting wild sometimes. And I think it's easy for us to forget that as adults, as adults that are trying to be responsible and live responsible lives. We put all of this pressure on ourselves to do the right thing, make the right decision, choose the right partner. And in reality, we can't know what's, quote, right or not. We can make educated guesses and operate based on that, absolutely. But we forget to dial in and follow our hearts. We forget to connect to that part of us that knows that even though this thing that we desperately want isn't, quote, right, it might be exactly what we need. It might be the perfect thing to help us in this moment, or to heal us in the long term, or to give us an experience that will be valuable in our future, or whatever. As adults, it seems like we finally have this power to give ourselves the freedom, and instead, we jail ourselves in work and societal obligations, familial obligations, expectations, when the truth of ourselves is in the wild. When we give ourselves these windows of freedom, real freedom, to get genuinely wild, and I'm talking about the little ones, the windows where we decide to take the risk, where we decide to do the thing that makes no sense at all, but just feels right in the moment. That is a moment in which we're connecting with our inner child. That is a moment in which we're giving ourselves permission to be human, to make a mistake, even if we know it's a mistake, and explore what we can learn from that, explore what we can get out of that experience. The reality is that there is a deep spirituality in just being human, in the human experience. The true result of manifestation is drawing the soul self, the highest self, that God force energy into the physical world, living it, carrying it around in our bodies, manifesting it out into our lives, and experiencing it, experiencing ourselves as soul beings on this physical plane, in a body. And in order to give ourselves the richest possible version of that experience, we have to take a risk once in a while. We have to step outside of what is, quote, right, and just follow our hearts. Just do what we really believe and know we want to do, and believe that that's the right thing, even if it doesn't work out like we expect it to, even if it doesn't look like it's, quote, successful in the physical world. The thing is, that's so much easier to say and do in my normal life. In the context of love, it feels real scary. All of my young adult life, I thought love was the only thing that was really real. Like that was the only thing I could count on. It was the only guarantee. It was the only sort of safe place in life, in this experience of being human. And then I learned that it hurts. And humans suck at it sometimes, myself included. So I swung all the other way and decided that the only safe version of love I could get my head around was separating sex and love, like platonic love. Platonic love lasts. The love that I have with my sister, with my best friend, that will be there forever. That love I can count on. And because sex doesn't require love, I felt like I could get both. I could feel and embrace all the love that I had for myself, to myself. And I could receive the love from my sister, from my best friend, from all the people in my life that love and support me. And I could just have sex on the side. Just sex. Because, of course, we all need to be touched. And so sex became the place where I felt like I could get a little wild. I could just go with any guy that I felt like I wanted to at any given point. And I did. And it was great. But it turned out that it's just not enough, It just isn't. There's a connection that's missing there in that version of life for me. So I finally kind of put it out to the universe like, okay, all right, I want real connection with someone that I'm going to have sex with. So, real connection, not an actual relationship, good sex. Can we get that? And then a couple of weeks ago, this guy got a hold of me. And we'd met years ago when I was traveling through Colombia, before I was in any kind of relationship here. And we stayed in contact throughout the relationship that I did end up having here. And it was all very respectful and platonic. But when that relationship ended, when my relationship ended, and this gentleman found out about that, he, started to get a little flirty, get a little cute. And I was into it. And eventually he asked me to come see him, to come visit him. And for a long time, that was like a hard no, Like, I do not need to get emotionally involved with someone else. I mean, that level of getting wild was way outside my comfort zone at that point. But months later, as I started to open up to this idea of connection, I thought, why not? I could use a little vacation. I analyzed and overanalyzed. I just tried to decide when was the right time and when wasn't, whether or not it was a good idea to invest a lot or just a little in this experience emotionally, 4 days or 5. I mean, it was just ridiculous. I went way over, trying to protect myself by making, quote, the right decision, the responsible one, the logical one. I finally decided just screw it. I really felt like the divine part of me, my inner goddess, if you will, was pushing me in a general sense in my life to break myself out of all of these boundaries I had set around myself, particularly in the context of love and sex and relationships, but also in my career and in my social circles. It just felt like it was time. This is a chance. This is a gift that I've been given where I am an adult with lots of freedom. Why am I so concerned about doing everything right all the time and not just following my heart on a whim? So I did. Packed up the car, packed up the dog, headed to Medellin, this beautiful city that's about a day's drive from Bogota. And when I met up with this guy, from the very first moment, it was an absolutely magical experience. We had a connection that neither of us had been aware of. And for the next 5 days, we road tripped all over this little region of Colombia. And we talked and listened to music and told stories and cracked each other up. We stopped by random waterfalls and parks and picnicked. We played in rivers. We visited a salt mine. We hiked down a waterfall. We watched the eclipse happen. We zip-lined through the jungle. We visited the highest point in Medellin and viewed the stars coming out over the city and the lights coming on underneath them. Fireworks, literal fireworks going off all over the city. And we just stood and took it all in together. And he held me close, and I loved the way he respected me. I loved the way he talked to me. I loved the way he touched me. And he whispered in my ear, "Is 2 weeks too soon to come back?" But we both knew that wasn't going to happen. I did stay an extra day. We did travel an extra day together. But we had known going in that this was going to be temporary for several reasons, and they don't matter. The point is, he's not my person, and I'm not his, and that's okay. But with his hand on my thigh, as we drew near to the place where I would have to drop him off and go on the rest of the journey to Bogota alone, we both felt tears sting our eyes. And when we got out of the car and held each other, it was just an agonizing moment, so bittersweet, to say goodbye to someone with whom I had connected. I'd felt something deep, profound with him. We loved each other for 5 days. In those moments, in the way that we interacted, in the way that we celebrated each other and our lives together, not us together, our individual lives at the same time, side by side. Yes, it was heartbreaking to leave it behind, but we loved. We loved on each other. We loved for each other, to each other. We healed each other. And when I got back in the car and drove away, I had this kind of beautiful realization as tears are streaming down my face that loving that deeply out loud is so precious that it's worth it. Even when we know the relationship is going to end, even when we know there's going to be heartbreak, it's always going to hurt. It's always going to end, one way or the other. But I had the thought that perhaps I've been approaching this from the wrong side. Like, instead of trying to avoid that hurt and heartbreak by splitting these two things up, sex and love being different, perhaps I should risk it more often. Get my heart broken. Fuck yeah. Feel the pain, absolutely. Because the best way forward is to love as wildly as possible, without boundaries. The best way to heal is to feel loved, to allow myself to receive that. Perhaps rather than sex, love is the one place to really lean in and get wild. Maybe love is the one place that we should be taking the craziest risks. We should be going the furthest outside our boundaries. We should be approaching it as though, yes, it's going to hurt, but it could also be such a beautiful thing that it'll make the pain worth it. Ultimately, in my new revised opinion, in the context of romantic relationships, if we know it's going to hurt, is it worth it to get wild and risk it? Abso-fucking-lutely. I hope you all have a wonderful, wild week. Give yourself a little freedom this week. Do something kind of crazy. But, be careful. Don't hurt yourselves. Or anybody else for that matter. If you like this podcast, please remember to subscribe. And consider supporting us on Patreon, where you'll get deeper dives, more information, the deeper analysis from a spiritual standpoint of how these daily life interactions can help us to evolve and be better beings and love our lives more. That's patreon.com/Jacqueline Lene. And if you're interested in showing yourself a little more self-love, deepening your relationship with who you are, connecting to that divine force within you, there are loads of resources available on my website. Workshops, books, personal support sessions, and more. That's authorjacquelinelanae.com. JACLYNLANAE. Thanks for listening.